Committee will come to order. Good morning. I would like to welcome a new member to the committee. On the minority side, Representative Joseph Carr represents the 2nd District of Louisiana. It's Cal, right? Carr, Cal?
Gal, like cow with
Gal.
a G.
Gal. Gal. Yeah. I'm happy you didn't hear me. After consultation with the ranking member and pursuant to Committee Rule 8, I am assigning him to the Federal Workforce Committee. I welcome the gentleman and look forward to his contribution, and I yield to the ranking member of the committee, the gentleman from California, Congressman Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before we start this important hearing, I think it is important to have our newest member seated. Representative Gao asked for this committee, competed for this committee, made the case for why the things that happen in his home parishes in Louisiana are so critically related to this committee, and I agree with him. This committee, of course, after Hurricane Katrina, certainly has been down to his district a lot. But more importantly, this is a member who has requested it because he believes that this committee has an important part in rooting out waste, fraud, and abuse in government. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd ask unanimous consent after the vote that he have a moment just to speak.
I'd like to yield to him 2 minutes at this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I would like to thank the ranking member for the opportunity and honor to serve.
Mr. Chairman,
you speak directly into the mic, yeah, right into it, yes.
You can tell I'm new to this committee here. But I'm losing my voice because of a cold that I've been fighting. But I'm very honored to be in this committee in order to serve, to make sure that we as a body, as a government, work and function in a very effective and efficient manner. I know that after Hurricane Katrina, we experienced tremendous amount of fraud and waste down there at the district. And one of the messages that I campaigned on when I was running for U.S. Congress was to make sure that we operate at the governmental level in a very ethical fashion. So I'm glad to be able to serve in this committee to make sure that everything that we do here as a body to be transparent and to be moral and ethical. So with that, I yield back my time, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much.
Thank you, gentlemen. We're delighted to have you on the committee. Look forward to working with you. This is a very active committee, and of course, we're certain that you'll fit in well. Just over a year ago, the United States economy lurched towards near ruin. Venerable financial institutions staggered towards collapse, and the market was in free fall. Americans were stunned as their savings disappeared overnight. The value of their homes plummeted, and their jobs disappeared. To save the economy from going from recession to depression, the federal government launched the largest bailout of private companies in history. America's leading financial firms were on life support when the Treasury Department injected them with hundreds of billions of dollars of taxpayers' money. AIG, once the largest insurance company in America, became the single largest recipient of bailout dollars. AIG was the victim of one of its own divisions, AIG's financial products, which engage in the risky and unregulated trading that many blame for the company's collapse. The American taxpayers came to the rescue with an $85 billion bailout of AIG last September. That was followed by more money in October, more again in November, and still more in March of this year. In the end, the federal government had committed $180 billion to save AIG. Americans were justifiably outraged when they learned shortly thereafter that AIG was paying $165 million in bonuses to executives at the very division that caused the collapse of the company. But even that figure pales before what the Special Inspector General learned in the course of his audit, which he is releasing at our hearing today. Not long after the last administration had shoveled $85 billion into the failing giant, Federal Reserve officials learned that AIG's units plan to distribute a combined total of $1.7 billion in bonuses and other extraordinary compensation. That is the justification for giving bonuses to people who drove their own firm off a cliff and very nearly crashed the United States economy. Wasn't there something seriously out of whack here? This does not make a lot of sense to me. It turns out it wasn't always that way at AIG. The SIGTARP audit found that AIG's compensation used to be weighted towards long-term incentives that were payable only at retirement. In other words, they used the classic golden handcuffs. But in 2007, when losses began to mount, AIG knew management decided to update their compensation plans. The golden handcuffs were replaced by golden envelopes. The era of instant gratification had arrived at AIG. Long-term incentives were rejected in favor of short-term gains. Don't get me wrong, Americans don't resent people who make a lot of money. We all want to make a lot of money. But what infuriates people is when bosses at bailout companies, virtual awards of the state, continue to rake in millions. That's the problem. In effect, our millions, it just doesn't seem right that people who caused this tragedy should be so richly rewarded. You know, this is sort of unusual. Generally, when people are rewarded, it's the fact that they've done a fantastic job and they receive extra benefits for doing a great job. You're not generally rewarded when you're taking the company down the wrong road. Unfortunately, this is still very much an issue. AIG's current bonus proposal is under review by the Treasury Department's Special Master, Ken Feinberg. We will be hearing from Mr. Feinberg 2 weeks from now at our second hearing on executive compensation. Today we welcome back Special Inspector General Neil Borowski, who just completed his audit of AIG's compensation. Perhaps today we will shed additional light on what many American taxpayers are asking. Why didn't the federal government impose pay concessions on bailout companies? Why were huge bonuses paid to executives of firms that would now be in bankrupt but for a taxpayer bailout? How much more in lavish bonuses will the American taxpayers be required to foot? What have we learned about executive compensation and corporate performance from our experience with AIG? Again, I want to thank Mr. Borowski for appearing here today and for the outstanding work that he has done. At this point, I'd like to yield 5 minutes to the committee's ranking member, Mr. Darrell Issa of San Diego, California.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for holding this hearing on SIGTARP's audit today. I look forward to the Special IG's testimony and his report. Mr. Chairman, I believe examining the federal government's role in AIG bonus is important, and it must be done by this committee. It is clear that this committee, having broad jurisdiction and the willingness to do oversight, cannot be discounted. As you might imagine, I would say that financial services should have helped prevent this and overseen it every step of the way, as should the New York Fed. But you will also find that today I'm concerned that the era of political bankruptcies is just beginning. We certainly, as a committee, cannot continue to ignore vital issues, and I will ask about these, related to the role of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, the bailouts of General Motors and Chrysler, and the future of FHA, and I know this committee will not shrink from its duty. Last March, the American people learned that employees of AIG Financial Products, or FP, the very division responsible for making the bets that sank the company, were getting hundreds of millions of dollars in retention payments for what ultimately had been their failure. AIG's CEO told us that the company needed to retain AIG FP employees because they had technical skills to unwind the company's risky investments in order to pay back the taxpayers. However, it is clear that it was not about paying back the taxpayers. In fact, during the so-called unwinding, that $180 billion, much of it went to paying 100 cents on the dollar for, in fact, credit defaults or insurance programs which would not have ordinarily in bankruptcy been paid full. And more important, the Treasury made a decision at the very time in which mark-to-market was on everyone's lips not to, in fact, purchase these credit defaults at their market. You had pieces of paper which were floating around at a market rate of 20 or 30 cents on the dollar or more, and in fact, we paid 100 cents on the dollar. Many people during this hearing will probably not have realized that AIG was a conduit for paying Goldman Sachs and others billions of dollars at 100 cents on the dollar, when in fact that paper would ordinarily have been discounted considerably, meaning permanently these people who got $168 million in retention bonuses were part of a larger political bankruptcy that led to the higher price being paid, in fact 100 cents on the dollar, when in fact the market rate was a fraction of that. Mr. Chairman, I might point out this went on under the Bush administration. This is not something that this president did anything but inherit. And I hope that we will recognize that what we're doing here today is talking about a pattern of mistakes that I will characterize mostly as political bankruptcies being run by the government. The pattern of rewarding failure during the Bush administration, unfortunately, appears to continue during the current administration. Rather than learning from the mistakes of his predecessor, President Obama has entangled the federal bureaucracy across the private sector. Rather than letting failed companies fail through a bankruptcy system, we constantly are putting money in and then political influence. Mr. Chairman, General Motors was a political bankruptcy. Chrysler was a political bankruptcy. The American people and their kids and grandkids will pay the price. The lesson we ought to take from the story of AIG retention bonus today is rewarding failure through a policy of bailouts and circumventing the rule of law and ordinary procedures within bankruptcy cost the taxpayers far more than if, in fact, we had backstopped what we were obligated to backstop. If we had said to the bankruptcy court, you determine what portion the federal government should pay, and the American people will step up to the plate. However, no one on either side of this dais for a moment believes that 100 cents on the dollar would have been what the American people would have paid. Tens of billions of dollars were paid out because this was a political bankruptcy and not handled by a federal judge as our law requires. Mr. Chairman, I thank you for your indulgence and yield back.
Thank you, gentleman, for his opening statement. Anyone seeking recognition this time? Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Cummings, is recognized for 3 minutes for the opening statement.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. As I listened to Mr. Ice, I could not help but remember, and I hope we don't get amnesia, that it was a Republican president that bought, and a Mr. Paulson, who was appointed by President Bush, who came to this Congress saying that the sky was falling. Come on, give me a break. And what this Congress did, and mainly Democrats trying to help this president get us out of this mess, was to do something that we did not like, to hold our nose and to address this issue the way we did. So let's not get amnesia here. The fact still remains is that we have a lot to do. AIG, and I've said it many times, starting back in December of 2008, had not been truly honest with the Congress of the United States of America. You know, I met with Mr. Liddy, and after I wrote a letter to him, and he constantly told me, the former chairman, he constantly told me about bonuses, and every time he never gave us all the information. Back after my letter of December 1st, Mr. Liddy responded a few days later that it would be 168 employees receiving these payments in amounts between $160,000 and $4 million. Mr. Liddy and I then exchanged a series of letters and even sat down face to face to discuss the issue, and I explicitly asked that AIG be a good corporate citizen. Mr. Liddy assured me that AIG would be just that. Well, AIG cut off our communications, and later we learned that upwards of 4,500 people, not 160 people, would be receiving bonuses and retention payments totaling over, as the chairman has already said, over $1 billion. Further, around 400 employees at the Financial Products Division, which is the very division that brought AIG down and brought the country down as far as I'm concerned, we found out that they were getting $450 million in so-called retention payments. The same Financial Products Division that brought AIG to its knees would be rewarding its traders reckless risk-taking with enormous corporate payouts to stick around and undo their handiwork. National unemployment was 8.5% when this happened. It stands to reason that there were very talented people out of work, traders on Wall Street, that might have been able to do this work without hundreds of millions of dollars in retention payments. Mr. Chairman, I see my time is running out, but I want to be very, very clear. I think we've done the best that we can do, and we're going to have to continue to be vigilant. Nobody likes what AIG did, and this report certainly does not shed a brilliant, wonderful light about what they did. And I want to thank you, Mr. Bobrovsky, for all that you've done, because you have presented yourself in a very forthright way, and we appreciate it. And we'll continue to work with you to try to make sure we get to the bottom of these bonuses and these junkets and whatever. Mr. Chairman, thank you for your indulgence.
I'd like to thank the gentleman from Maryland for his statement. Anyone on seeking recognition?
Real briefly.
Gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton.
Real briefly, Mr. Chairman, I'm glad you're holding these hearings. I think it's extremely important that we look into this very thoroughly. I think this should also include other issues of great significance and importance. There have been allegations that there has been special treatment given to some government officials regarding loans. Countrywide, we had a hearing on that at some point in the past, and during that hearing, we asked the chairman of Countrywide a great many questions about preferential treatment, and it's been in the papers a lot, and I hope, and I know the chairman, or the ranking member shares our position on this, I hope that we will have a very thorough investigation of not just AIG, but other things where there might have been some corruption.
Anyone else seeking recognition? Yes, gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing. And I think that those members who are concerned about the conduct of people in the Senate or in the House, we understand that the purpose of this committee, government oversight, is to monitor the activities that are going on in the private sector and in government. But the rules of the House require that the structure that's been set up by the House, which is the Ethics Committee, be used, and that this committee is not the appropriate place to start going after other members of Congress. Once we start that, we can't, what else are we going to do in this committee? The American people are relying on us to be able to try to straighten out this economy and to make Wall Street accountable. Now, whatever flaws members of Congress may have, and all of us do, I think that the Ethics Committee is the appropriate venue for those, and people have complaints to bring, they ought to do that. But to keep trying to bring it up in this committee to challenge the conduct of other members of Congress, be they in the House or the Senate,
would the gentleman yield?
I think actually what it does is it slows the momentum that we need to build, bipartisan.
Would the gentleman
momentum
yield?
We need to build to be able to accomplish the goals of this committee.
Would my colleague yield?
I will in a minute. This committee has to deal with over $13 trillion in spending that's been put out there by the Treasury and by the Fed. And I think my colleagues on the other side certainly know that I haven't pulled any punches when it's come to the administration at all, nor will I. Will not. But come on, we can't use this committee to snipe at each other all the time. We've got to focus, keep our eye on the ball. And I'm glad we're having a hearing on AIG's bonuses. But we need to go a lot deeper.
Well, will the gentleman yield?
I'll yield.
What I said in my remarks was that there have been allegations that some government officials, I didn't mention members of Congress, some government officials may have gotten preferential treatment from places like Countrywide. And when I was chairman, we followed it where it led for 6 years. And so, you know, I'm not talking about congressmen, but I am talking about people in government who have very high positions who may have got preferential treatment in order to do things. And I think we need to investigate that. I don't know that it's going to mean, I don't know that it's going to mean members of Congress.
Reclaiming my time, I want to say that, you know, there were some investigations that Mr. Burton had when he was chairman, Mr. Burton, that I supported. And, you know, I just, but the one thing I thought was important when you were chairman, it's important when Mr. Towns is chairman, is that, look, yeah, we follow investigations wherever we lead. But if someone wants to imply, expressly or otherwise, that there's people that we have to start to look at within the Congress of the United States, I say that's what the Ethics Committee is all about.
Would the gentleman yield?
And you know, my time's expired, but I think that, you know, we're going to put this on the table here and either put it to rest, or this committee is going to end up becoming an armed camp going against each other. I don't think we need to do that. Let's keep our eye on the ball. Let's challenge Wall Street. Let's Mr. Borofsky get a chance to tell us what he's found, and make these firms on Wall Street accountable. And if there's anybody in the government holding hands with them, you know, let's look at them too.
The gentleman's time has expired. Mr. Michael, Florida.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And let me just say for the record, I've heard, you know, again, we hear blame it on Bush. I think our ranking member did indicate that some of the crises did start during the Bush administration. The TARP was created partially under the Bush administration, and at least half of the funds were left to the current administration. I believe if we just look at what we're doing here today, we're looking at the distribution on Friday, March 13th, 2009, that's this year, this administration, when AIG began distributing $165 million, and that's when we had a significant amount of TARP money into this. And we're here today to hear report of a special Inspector General on that money from that account in this year. So that's why we're here. People had their hands in the cookie jar during this administration, and we need to find out what took place and how the taxpayer once again got ripped off. And this $165 million is only part of nearly two-thirds of $1 billion of bonuses that I want to hear about that were used or abused or misused by AIG. I'd like to yield to our ranking member, if I may.
I thank the gentleman. And for my friend and colleague from Ohio, Mr. Kucinich, please understand that our request to continue on the Countrywide investigation recognizes that, first of all, the Senate Ethics Committee has made it clear that the recipients on the Senate side that are known about committed no ethical violations as recipients. That clearing is a clearing very narrowly of the recipients, not of the company that clearly was spending millions of dollars through a discount program to curry favor. I have offered the chairman, and would reiterate the offer to the chairman, that we could redact any, and I repeat, any and all loans related to members of Congress, and I would happily investigate the question of what did they want to do with Franklin Raines, what did they want to do with the Postmaster General, what did they want to do with a key Republican staffer on the Financial Services Committee to provide VIP loans. Not what did those people do in return. What I'm most concerned is what did Countrywide want, and if possible, what did they get, but most importantly, what did they want? For the chairman's and the subcommittee chairman's edification, please understand, Mr. Kucinich, I have been told that no laws were violated under existing statutes by Countrywide. That begs the question for the American people, should there have been a law, and if there isn't a law, don't we have an obligation to say, do we want to have corporate America providing, in secret, millions of dollars in discounts to high-ranking government officials in the future? Because if we do nothing, then the status quo is it's ethically and legally allowed.
Gentleman's time from Florida has expired. Anyone else seeking? Gentlewoman from California.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. This is a very important and significant hearing. I'm going to take my full 5 minutes, but I'd like to yield
No, it's 3 minutes, ma'am.
3 minutes, okay. I'd like to yield a minute to Mr. Kucinich.
I want to thank the gentlelady, just to respond to my colleague, and that is that, look, I don't hold any brief for anybody who's doing anything wrong, especially members of Congress. But we better be careful about using our positions to promote innuendo or to inadvertently smear someone else's name. I yield back.
Mr. Chairman.
At the beginning of 2008...
Gentleman from California has the time.
At the beginning of 2008, AIG was the world's largest insurance company with operations in 130 countries and more than $1 trillion in assets. Yet by the end of 2008, AIG was relying on $150 billion in federal money for survival as a result of the complex derivatives being peddled in their financial products division. Despite the fact that it was the self-destructive business practices driven by short-term gain rather than long-term sustainability of the financial products division, which resulted in the government owing 79.9% of the business, it was revealed in March that these same employees would be receiving $165 million in so-called retention bonuses. I don't understand, if you're doing your job and you do it satisfactorily, why do you have to have a bonus? You're being paid for doing your job. So this revelation has rightly stoked outrage on behalf of the American taxpaying public. In this recession, Americans outside of Wall Street have seen their jobs, their savings, and their sense of security diminished, while those responsible for the reckless business practices that led to the crisis receive rescue funds from the government and bonuses completely unrelated to the market performance of their employer or the actual caliber of their work. I sincerely hope, and I want to thank our witness, that we will have the necessary information. This is the Oversight Committee, and we need to be watching with a close eye to how we handle taxpayers' money, and I'm very, very pleased that we have this opportunity, Mr. Chairman, to hear from our witness. Thank you.
Thank you. I'd like to thank the gentlewoman from California for a statement. Anyone seeking Congressman McHenry from North Carolina.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield my time to the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And just for the record, if we look at AIG going into the pre-bankruptcy period, it is commonly stated that they had over $1 trillion in assets. Reviewing the June 2008 financials, what you discover is to get $1 trillion, you have almost $400 billion worth of the value of bonds that haven't been sold. So, you know, if you've ever had a kited value on a balance sheet, it's when you say you've got $1 trillion, $1 trillion, but then you have $400 billion worth of assets that are basically, if somebody would buy my bonds. And that's probably more telling of the fact that the underlying assets were going to go down, but that asset was already effectively zero unless somebody wanted to pay for it. And further, because there was a further comment by Mr. Kucinich, let's understand that if, in fact, because there was a member of Congress, two senators actually, involved in receiving countrywide loans, if that's our basis to say it's innuendo, if we want to go after an organization that dumped onto the American people not billions, but trillions in total, and has cost the American people hundreds of billions of dollars worth of losses because of their action in coordination with the GSEs, then I think we miss the whole point of how can we say we can't go there. This side of the aisle certainly would be more than happy to do any and all limitations in the documents so that we were not looking at members of Congress but looking only at countrywide. But today there are boxes of documents sitting at Bank of America, which Bank of America said they would like to give us, but for reasons of not being sued by individuals involved in that whose names would be on it, they wanted to have a subpoena, and yet we won't give one. And I might mention that this committee asked and received the same company, Bank of America, a waiver on attorney-client privilege in order to get the full facts related to Merrill Lynch. If we can not only subpoena, but demand and negotiate a waiver of attorney-client privilege, how could we not at least look at the documents related to what did now B of A, but then countrywide individuals attempt to do to influence government actions that led to hundreds of billions of dollars of loss to the American people? And I yield back.
Gentleman from North Carolina. Anyone else seeking recognition? Let me just say before we move forward, to the gentleman from California, and of course, that this is not a super ethics committee. The ethics committee has its role and its function, and I think they'll do a good job. But I don't see in terms of this committee. And I must say that to the gentleman who served here as the chair of this committee, and I must admit I enjoyed working with him, he may probably set a record in terms of the amount of subpoenas that he issued. But he did not subpoena anybody from the Congress. And I think we need to just think about it. Let's put it all in the proper perspective so we can move forward. And let's not lose sight on the bigger picture. We're talking about companies that received TARP money, government money, and then just sort of like gave it to people who really didn't perform well. And then when it was questioned, they said it's retention. Why would you keep somebody that's not performing well? You wouldn't do it on your staff. So on that note, I yield back. Yes, gentleman from Massachusetts. Yes. Yeah.
Mr. Chairman, I came here today to talk about AIG, and I assume that we'll listen to Mr. Borowski in a minute to hear about AIG, and I appreciate the work that he's done. But I also think that this committee ought to be cautious about using this committee as a platform to go after other members. That's what the Ethics Committee is about, if there's a question about the conduct of other members. And that we you know, sometimes we on this side are in the majority, sometimes you on the other side are in the majority. So we have to be careful from our respective positions about setting a precedent here that would inevitably lead to calls in the future to issue subpoenas for other House members that are involved in similar controversies. Got to realize we're setting a precedent with what we do here. And I just ask my friends, and you are my friends on both sides of the aisle, to be cautious about what you're advocating here, because if we want to start subpoenaing mortgage records in an investigation that deals with improper influence, we want to start subpoenaing mortgage records of members of Congress. This committee does that. It doesn't leave that up to ethics. Then what's to stop us from subpoenaing financial contributions and to start asking people to give testimony under oath about the financial contributions that they got from certain interests? This is why. This is not what the work that this committee ought to be doing. We start investigating each other, and I assume there'd be a lot of opportunities that we could all have doing that. We wouldn't be doing anything else. It'd just be a partisan morass. So let's lift our eyes a little bit higher than that. That's not in any way to dismiss the gravity of any improper conduct anywhere by anyone, but it's to say that we create a structure in our system here to deal with questions about the conduct of members of Congress. And if there's a problem and that structure isn't working properly, then members of Congress have to account for that, and we have to make it work. But we can't be using this committee for the purposes of trying to bring down each other. Just not right. So, Mr. Borowski, today we're going to talk about AIG, I assume, and we're going to talk about the bonuses and what we can do to stop a practice from when the American people gave all this money out to make sure that their money isn't being misspent. So I thank you for being here. Just want to say welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And now, Fortenberry, Nebraska. Yield 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to yield as much time as he'd like to consume to Mr. Issa.
I thank the gentleman. Mr. Kucinich, you're my friend and fellow Clevelander, and I would hope that what I say now you hear so that you don't have to give an answer that is completely off what I've said previously again. I am perfectly willing to have the subpoena include no members of Congress, none. None of their records, none of their mortgages. This is not about members of Congress, the House or the Senate. The Senate Ethics Committee has already spoken that there was no violation for receiving these by 2 senators. We don't need to look further. That has been done. However, I hope the gentleman will realize that Countrywide did this for a reason. Countrywide individuals, including a whistleblower, have already told us that they intended to influence for the benefit of Countrywide and its ability to, now we know, put toxic loans onto the books of the GSEs. That is, in fact, what happened. So, Mr. Borowski, I appreciate your indulgence. It is very clear that that's not what this hearing is about today. But on Thursday, when I request a subpoena, which I've noticed the chairman, I would hope that everybody would allow for a straight up or down vote on the merits of the request for subpoena. That request will be narrow. We do not want to investigate members of Congress. Other committees may do that. What we want to do is we want to know what was it that internal memos and documents related to other people in and out of government, what were they trying to achieve? Why did they give tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars of discount to a broad array of people? We are not interested in the people they didn't want influence from, and we're not interested in members of Congress. And I might say, when we're saying on this side of the aisle, we don't want anything to do with the members of Congress, we're more than happy to look toward Countrywide, because Countrywide is the organization that has led more than any other single organization to the loss of billions of dollars of American taxpayer money. So, although Mr. Borowski can do a good job cleaning up after the flood and trying to deal with the liquidity of the market and so on, we have an obligation to make sure this never happens again. And this will happen again if corporate America is allowed to bribe people around government in order to get them either to do things for them or, in this case, turn a blind eye to billions of dollars, tens and hundreds of billions of dollars of toxic loans being put onto the backs of the American people through these GSEs, which had the full faith and credit of the American people. That's what it's about. And it's more important that we make sure it doesn't happen again than, in fact, whether $165 million went to a group of people who are now unemployed. That is what we're here talking about. And Mr. Kucinich, you're my friend. I hope you hear this time. I do not want in this subpoena to ask for anything related to members of Congress, but I cannot allow this to continue, us seeing no evil when in fact we know there was evil. Yield back.
Moving forward, we'll turn now to the sole witness, Mr. Neil Borowski, the Special Inspector General for the Troubled Asset Relief Program, whose office has just completed an audit of the hundreds of millions of dollars of retention bonuses AIG has already paid and the millions more it expects to pay. It is committee policy that we swear in all of our witnesses. So will you please stand and raise your right hand? Do you solemnly swear to tell the truth and nothing but the truth? If so, answer in the affirmative. Let the record reflect that he answered in the affirmative. I'll ask all, actually, let me just say that you know the rules. We generally give you 5 minutes, but we want to give you 10. And then, of course, then go into questions and answers, because we think your report is just so valuable that you need additional time. So 10 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll try to stay under that. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Rice, members of the committee, it is a privilege and honor to return to testify before this committee and discuss with you today the audit that we released this morning into the circumstances surrounding AIG Financial Products payment of approximately $168 million in retention bonuses to more than 400 employees earlier this year. Last fall, policy decisions were made by the policymakers at Treasury and the Federal Reserve that a failure of AIG would have such a high systemic cost that it was worth the unprecedented bailout and use of taxpayer dollars to save that company. Federal Reserve went first. In September, gave a line of credit of $85 billion to AIG, and followed that by sending teams in to take a close, long, hard look at AIG's executive compensation structure. What they found was a mess. More than 600 different programs, some entitled bonuses, some deferred compensation, some retention plans, affecting more than 50,000 employees, programs so diverse and decentralized that AIG senior executives themselves weren't involved in the approval of many of these plans and didn't have a full sense of what they were. A mess so sprawling that even as we concluded our audit late this summer, federal executives at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, at AIG, and the Fed's consultants still did not have their arms wrapped around the entire AIG executive compensation structure. The Fed, and by the Fed I'm referring to Federal Reserve Bank of New York, looked at executive compensation from its unique perspective. It looked at the amount of money involved and concerned whether bleeding of cash would impact AIG's ability to repay its loan. They looked to see whether the structure had perverse incentives that would encourage executives to make decisions that would be not in the best interest of the company, and most importantly from the Fed's perspective, inhibit the ability to repay the loan. Treasury, on the other hand, paid scant attention to the executive compensation structure. Other than discovering and figuring out who the 50 or so employees that would be subject to its executive compensation restrictions that were included in the November $40 billion TARP bailout, Treasury did little more. As a result, when the March 2009, earlier this year, AIG Financial Products retention payments came through, Treasury didn't know about them until 2 weeks beforehand. And they didn't know the scope of those payments, that they were going to apply not just to essential personnel, but also to non-essential, people who worked in the mailroom, in the kitchen, in the file room. Our audit in this concludes that this was a failure. It was a failure of oversight by Treasury, which essentially abdicated its role in favor of allowing the Federal Reserve, notwithstanding the fact that the Fed had different interests and different concerns than Treasury. It's reflected perhaps most clearly by the fact that its agreement with AIG included no provisions relating to executive compensation. Our audit also concludes that Secretary Geithner did not learn of these bonus payments until just days before they were made. But this too is a failure. It was a failure of communications, and it was a failure of management. Executives and senior officials at FRBNY knew about these bonus payments back in the fall of 2008 when Secretary Geithner was then president of FRBNY, but none of them alerted him or elevated this issue, according to our audit's findings, notwithstanding the explosive nature and controversial nature of the payments. At Treasury, they didn't find out until 2 weeks before, but even then it took them 10 days to elevate this issue to the Secretary's level, even though the Fed had warned them when they notified them about the size of these payments, of the intense press and congressional concern about them, and said in their words that they were not going to be easy for Treasury and Fed to defend. Based on these failings, our audit contained 3 recommendations. First, when we were conducting our audit, we learned that the special master, Kenneth Feinberg, while doing his evaluation of AIG's executive compensation, had been in touch with FRBNY officials, even though they've spent better part of a year studying AIG's executive compensation and spent a lot of resources on hiring a consultant. We made a recommendation, and after receiving a draft version of this report, we've been informed that Treasury has adopted this recommendation, and Mr. Feinberg is now dealing with his counterparts at the FRBNY. We also make 2 recommendations looking forward. First, that in the future, if Treasury is going to be making this type of investment, this type of bailout of a company, that have policies in place to make sure that there's going to be a comprehensive and not ad hoc review of the executive compensation and other politically sensitive issues, so that they know in advance when these issues are lurking around the corner. And second, to the extent that Treasury continues to rely on other federal agencies or other entities to conduct its compliance for it, to outsource its oversight, that it do so with policies in place, a plan in place. For if there's anything that we've learned from this audit and the circumstances of March of this year, a failure to give clear directions and have a clear communication protocol with an oversight entity that's doing the oversight for you is a recipe for the disastrous consequences and results that we saw earlier this year. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, members of the committee, that concludes my opening statement today, and I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much for your statement, and thank you for the work that you have done. You have done a superb job, and we thank you for it. Let me begin by saying AIG is now proposing to pay another $198 million in bonuses. So we have history repeating itself. Shouldn't those bonuses be reduced given the poor performance of the company?
I think these are exactly the issues that Mr. Feinberg is now grappling with, is looking at these bonus payments, not just within respect of financial products, but in the overall picture of AIG's bonus situation. There's an opportunity that's here because of the advanced knowledge that really didn't exist last time because it took so long for senior officials at Treasury to know about them until just days beforehand. But I think those are very important considerations that are going to be addressed.
Yeah. Now, I know after the media got into the situation that last year, well, during the spring, the uproar over AIG's bonuses, AIG announced that its executives had agreed to return $45 million. How much of that really was collected?
As of the conclusion of our audit fieldwork in August, it was $19 million had been collected.
Less than 50%, huh?
Less than 50%.
If I read your report correctly, some of these executives are refusing to give back the money unless they can get commitment that they're going to get the bonus the next year. So they're holding it in ransom.
I think it was described to us as a wait-and-see attitude. They want to see what they're going to be getting after Mr. Feinberg conducts his review of the $198 million next March before they commit or fulfill their commitment to pay back the bonuses. I think that's correct.
What about those that left the company?
AIG has noted that it will be difficult for them to enforce collecting the money for those that have left the company.
You know, the media has focused on the $165 million of bonuses AIG paid out in March. But isn't it true that shortly after the AIG bailout last September, the Federal Reserve learned that AIG had planned to pay over $1.7 billion in bonuses and retention plans?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman. Across all the different programs of the affecting approximately 50,000 AIG employees worldwide, that is the approximate number. And I say it's an approximate number because, as I mentioned, even today, they still don't have, or at least as we conclude our audit work, they still don't have their arms wrapped around all the various AIG bonus and retention and deferred compensation structures.
Right. Why didn't the last administration extract any bonus concessions out of AIG in return for the $85 billion bailout?
Well, the Federal Reserve put no restrictions in. They view themselves as a creditor as opposed to having made an investment. And the only provision in their agreements related to general governance issues, which is what they use to take a look at AIG's bonus structure, and why they focus on issues related to paying back money. And this is one of the criticisms of our report. When Treasury outsourced its oversight to the Federal Reserve had a far different interest and approach to executive compensation than what Treasury had to do as an investor on behalf of the government people. So their concerns were based on getting money to pay back the loan, but didn't Congress, when it enacted the TARP, required Treasury to consider when using TARP funds.
Right. Is it true that AIG's management still does not have these different bonus and retention obligations? Did AIG ever really know where all the money was going?
As of the time we concluded our audit work, that is correct. They did not know. This was an incredibly decentralized system. It was, as I mentioned in my testimony, a mess.
Right. Now, I know Treasury and New York Feds have been on the ground for months at AIG. Have they taken any steps to address this problem?
The Federal Reserve, I mean, to its credit, when it came in September, recognized what a mess it was, and they hired an outside consultant, Ernst & Young, who's assisted them in getting their arms wrapped around these programs. Some of the basic data took 5 or 6 months to pull out of human resources. So they have been making an effort and have committed resources, but the task is such an enormous one. But they have been trying to get their arms wrapped around these issues.
Right. Well, is it fair to say, based on your audit, that there's a breakdown in communications between Treasury, of course, and the Federal Reserve regarding AIG's plan?
I think that would be kind to have it as a breakdown. I think that they were essentially, after Treasury invested the $40 billion, communications were virtually non-existent.
Right. And then I think my final question before I yield, are Treasury's pay restrictions truly enforceable? How hard would it be if for TARP to recipients to circumvent the bonus restrictions? Well, they just said we're not going to do it and start looking for ways and methods.
It's particularly difficult with agreements like this that were executed prior to February 11th, 2009, which is the cutoff date in ARA, which set forth these restrictions. But on the flip side, we have to remember that we're also, with respect to AIG, we own 80% of the company. And that, I think sometimes it's important for the federal government to recognize the leverage that is associated with having such a significant ownership interest when seeking to renegotiate these payments.
All right. I now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from California, Mr. Issa.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I've called this a political bankruptcy, and I stand by that. Had a genuine bankruptcy occurred, isn't it true that all these contracts would have been immediately void or voidable?
Mr. Issa, I'm not a bankruptcy expert, so I'm not sure. But
has someone mentioned that to you at some point?
Yeah, no. I don't want to be definitively, but I'm pretty sure that a bankruptcy would certainly impact those types of contractual obligations.
You know, I fly United Airlines back and forth every week, so I sit and stand with the flight attendants who watch their obligation for their pension be shut off the day they went into bankruptcy, and what they got was pennies on the dollar. So I'm very familiar in that sense with how broad bankruptcy can be, even if I hadn't had to deal with it in my own business life. But looking forward, the Special Master, Mr. Feinberg, he is going to make these decisions, the pay czar, if you will. Are you going to have full access and oversight as the IG of his decision process?
Absolutely. That's clearly within our jurisdiction.
The next time we have you back, or if in an interim report if you can you do us a favor, I believe on both sides of the aisle, and de-aggregate, if you will, 165 million and all these numbers, and give us the amount that would be fair and reasonable, that should be paid, that would be paid, if you will, in somebody else's opinion, or the amount of people whose bonuses are not in question. And I bring this up for a moment. I'm not trying to say that we shouldn't have done a better job. As a matter of fact, the second half of what I'm going to ask is very much about that. But isn't it true that 165 million, some of those people should have gotten what they got, and some of those people got relatively small bonuses compared to others? Isn't that true?
I think it's a difficult question to answer because of the policy implications. As you noted, if there was a bankruptcy, it's likely that none of these people would have received any bonuses, and what the value of these individuals is really beyond the scope of our work. So it'd be difficult for me to answer that question.
Okay. Well, hopefully you'll be able to do it in some future time. Would you also, every time we get a report, give us the base pay of the individuals relative to bonus, so that we know over the covered period how much they made in pay? In other words, if you pay $1 billion in salaries and you have $165 million in bonuses, you have 16.5% bonus. On the other hand, if you pay $100 million in base pay and $165 million in bonuses, you got 165%. We need to know that. I think it's going to help this committee understand, or at least the American people understand, the magnitude. Because I believe up until now we've been dealing with these, first of all, small numbers compared to the trillions that are still floating around in the risk pool. And we probably have been stepping on some individuals who simply, sort of the janitor's bonus for not leaving and letting the toilets back up. You know, perhaps we should look at those as not all equal. Let me go to one other question, though, because, you know, when you talked about abrogating responsibility to the Fed, you really abrogated it, or I'm sorry, we abrogated it as the government through Treasury to Mr. Geithner. Isn't that true?
He was the president of FRBNY at this time, yes. Okay,
and the question for us here today is, what did he know and when did he know it and why didn't he know it? If today he's the Treasury Secretary, was he inept? And I'm going to go through a quick set of questions for you. My understanding is your investigation only went up to the senior vice president, probably AIG relationship monitoring. That would be the highest level that was interviewed. Is that roughly right?
As far as interviews are concerned, I know we did talk to the senior vice president level, but I also personally spoke with higher-ranking members at FRBNY.
Okay, so if the senior vice president in the area that we think over risk management would have been the person to talk to, above that you have an executive vice president, today it's Sandy Kruger. Above that you have a first vice president, today it's Christine Cummings. Above that you have a president. And of course above that you have the board of directors and the chairman of the board, and above that you had Tim Geithner. How do we know today that no one in that chain knew, we assume many of them did, and that none of them talked to Mr. Geithner? In other words, when your opening statement you said, well, the Fed didn't know. Well, how do we know they didn't know if these individuals haven't been personally interviewed to find out if they spoke to anyone at the Fed, including Federal Reserve Bank of New York, including Mr. Geithner?
Well, we do our review. Obviously, we request a broad range of documents. We ask to speak to a broad range of people. We ask to be identified a broad range of people. And in this audit, like all our audits, we talk to folks, senior people at the Federal Reserve, as well as at Treasury, as well as at AIG. And one of the questions that we asked was communications up into the then President, current Secretary, Mr. Geithner. We review those documents. We talk to a number of individuals. We talk to the individuals that we think are necessary. As far as Secretary himself, he has publicly made statements about the time of his knowledge, and we saw nothing in our report or in our interviews that would indicate that he was not being truthful. From our perspective, this is a significant failing in management, but I also think it's important to note, and this is sort of what gets to one of our recommendations, is that the Federal Reserve did not view until very recently, until recently before the payments were made, didn't really view these as much being of a big deal. They were looking at this purely from a dollars and cents perspective of $168 million, which, while significant, was a drop in the bucket compared to their overarching concern, which was paying back the debt. They were not concerned, and that's the problem about Treasury outsourcing this, because while Treasury may have been and would be required to have been more sensitive to these issues, the Federal Reserve was looking at this from a creditor, and $168 million from a creditor's perspective just wasn't that much of a concern. So I'm confident that my audit team took the steps that were necessary to answer that question. It's a question that I wanted them to answer about when Mr. Geithner became aware of this. And I would also like to note that we share our information and drafts of this audit report, and we check in both formally and informally to make sure that we have our facts right. There is nothing that could prevent individual officials at the Federal Reserve from lying to us. There's nothing that could prevent them from withholding documents that we requested, but we saw no indication of any of those things occurring. And I stand by my audit team's work on this in their belief that we didn't see anything that indicated that he knew before March 10th.
Gentleman,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Borowski. You talked during your opening statement about this failure to communicate somewhere between Treasury and the Federal Reserve. Who's dropping the ball there? I guess what I'm trying to do is trying to figure out how do we make sure that there's communication that needs to happen. I mean, so how would you remedy that? I looked at your recommendations and you seem to talk about a plan, but I'm just, how do you think we ought to try to deal with that?
I think the issue is that once a decision was made that the Federal Reserve was going to take the lead of doing oversight and doing compliance, there wasn't any protocol established. There wasn't any communication. Well, what types of things are we interested? What types of things were we looking at? Whether it's because of a lack of resources or a lack of commitment, the Fed was sort of left off to its own. And what we recommend is to learn the lesson here and establish first of all, in any extent possible, Treasury should directly be involved in providing oversight when it's TARP money. This is Treasury's responsibility ultimately. But in those circumstances where it's decided to outsource, there has to be established plans, policies, and procedures. Treasury needs to identify for the Federal Reserve what the issues that it wants it to follow up on, and then they have to maintain and follow up, set guideposts, set milestones, make it a priority to have that level of communication. I think ultimately it's difficult to assign blame squarely on one entity or the other, but ultimately it was Treasury's responsibility to provide oversight for the first $40 billion.
Now, in my discussions and letters with Mr. Liddy, exchange of letters with Mr. Liddy, the former CEO, he used all kinds of terms like retention payments, bonus payments. And he didn't use these words, but he did say that they needed to keep certain employees for winding down. They were the only people that could wind down. And it seems like it was all kinds of reasons why they were keeping these folks. But then when I see that we've got an unemployment rate of 8.5 and we're supposed to believe that AIG would not been able to replace, and I do have a lot of empathy for kitchen assistants and mailroom assistants getting $7,000 bonuses, and are we supposed to believe that AIG Financial Products could have unwound the problem trades without so-called crucial employees retaining them? I'm talking about for big money. It's not, as you know, it was not lightweight bonuses. These people got some nice funds. So, I mean, in your research, did you find, that there was a need to keep folks on? And it seems like it's such a wide range of folks who were getting bonuses. And when you get down to the mailroom, when you've got millions upon millions of people unemployed in our country, you have to wonder.
Congressman Hearnig, I think you're absolutely accurate. I don't think that it's defensible to suggest that if AIG did not pay a retention payment to a mailroom employee or a kitchen assistant, that employee A would necessarily leave, and if that employee left, whether it would be difficult to replace that position given the state of the economy. But I also think that the first part of your statement, this also is a problem with transparency. And I too was left with the impression after the hearings and all the public announcements that these payments were going to those who were necessary and involved to unwind these complex transactions. And it was one of the things that surprised me the most as I saw the audit work come in, that this was essentially to every single employee at Financial Products. And here, the failure of transparency goes to what we were discussing just a moment ago. The fact that Treasury had outsourced this and wasn't aware of this information meant that it couldn't be transparent about these payments because they didn't have that knowledge. And as I've discussed in other reports, and I'll be discussing in my quarterly report, which I'll be discussing with this committee next week, there's a cumulative effect from these failures of transparency.
Yeah, no doubt about it. And the question becomes, I think AIG was disingenuous at best and outright deceptive at worst. Because I'm going to tell you, based upon all the communications I got, and then to find out this kind of information, what that means is somebody simply was not telling the truth. And I think that's why the American people got so upset about this, and will get even more upset, because they feel that they have been, they think they're doing one thing, but yet and still they're losing their houses, their homes, their savings, and everything, while other people are getting these bonuses and saying that they're supposed to be retention payments, when really a lot of these people did not fit that category.
I think so, and I would throw one other possibility in there, which is just incompetence. The list that we received that put the positions with the bonus payments, that was something AIG had to create. It wasn't a document that existed beforehand that they created in response to our audit. So it may be that we were the first person to even ask the question of who were the people who actually got these bonuses and what their jobs were. But I don't know which category it fits within.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you very much. And now you have 5 minutes to the gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Burton.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of questions, then I'll yield to Mr. Issa. Mr. Issa mentioned that it would have been better, in many of our opinions, if we had let all these problems go through the regular bankruptcy procedures. But there were decisions made by the administrations to bail out a number of these companies. When the bailout procedures took place, there evidently was no provisions put in those agreements that said that since the government is loaning that money or spending that money to buy stock in those companies, that the government has the right to review the bonus procedures, was there?
Oh, no, absolutely not. There were very limited circumstances for a limited number of employees.
Now, in the event that, and there's a lot of people that believe we're not out of the woods yet as far as the economy is concerned, in the event that this comes up again in the not-too-distant future, and we don't go down the bankruptcy court route, could we put in those agreements, if the government is bailing out an industry, could we put in those agreements a specific language that would say that the government has to review and approve any bonuses before they're given?
It certainly would be a possibility.
Yeah. Well, that's the one thing I'd like to point out. That seems to me, I was not for the bailouts, did not vote for them.